on this computer. Hello and welcome to the next instalment of our webinar series hosted by Vic No-Till, focusing on relevant issues around soil carbon through a closer look at strategies to increase our soil organic matter. This project is supported by Wimmera CMA through funding from the Australian Government's National Landcare program. We'd really like to thank them very much for their support. For those that missed last week's webinar with Graeme, we have it recorded and it's available on our YouTube channel. Today, we're fortunate enough again to be joined by Graeme. Graeme is one of Australia's leading holistic land management and training consultants who has had over 25 years of planned grazing experience and holistic management training. This webinar is the second of a series of 6 webinars, with last week being the first one that we've done, with Graeme looking at rotational grazing. We haven't got a Q&A session set out at the end. We'd really like you to, if you have any questions, whether you might be able to enter them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and Graeme will address them as we go. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Graeme. Thanks, Graeme.
Thanks, Dan, and also thanks to Wimmera CMA and the National Landcare program. I'll kick off, share my screen, and hop into it. Fantastic. Quite a few questions to go through, so I've rejigged it a lot this week to sort of cover off on those questions. So I'll just do a really quick recap, and then do the questions, then talk about the different grazing practices. So sort of we need to be able to look at, well, you know, they're that type of grazer, they're that, and I've got a few questions about that sort of stuff, that there is different schools of thought and different grazing practices. The key thing to think about is that this area, and a lot of ag, is very complex. So, and to work out whether it's complex, a quick, easy way is, do the experts disagree? If the experts all agree, then it's usually just complicated. But the experts disagree, so it's complex, which leads you to, you've got to do your own safe to fail trial. And then I'll talk about putting it into, if we've got enough time, putting it into practice. But if we don't get that today, we'll definitely get it. So just quickly, declining terms of trade, the gap between farm income and what farmers are keeping is just getting wider, and debts being used to fund that widening gap. This also explains sort of why you've got to be really careful about getting advice from your accountant. So typically in a cropping situation, if people have a good year, they actually minimise their tax by spending or borrowing money, and that makes the business worse. So you've just got to be really careful that you don't let debt get away from you. It's more about minimising losses than maximising production. What can you do that, you know, it makes money every year? So slow and steady wins the race, which isn't very attractive. So that's my point of view. Others are sort of a bit more gung-ho about things, whereas I'm saying slow and steady wins the race. This is what I'm looking at as the definition of sort of turning around, you know, contemporary agriculture, you know, is that we have the land increasing in function and biodiversity, and nested within that we have low risk profit and increasing people wellbeing scores. So I'll keep coming back to that, but the low risk profit is what I talk about. And I've got a list of, you know, some of the other grazing advisors and things like that, and where their focus seems to be from my point of view. Just quickly, the science I use is landscape function. It's blue ribbon peer reviewed, double overhead foxtail science. So I've never seen this not work. So in a grazing situation, what it's saying is it needs to be based on, perennial grasses, mature perennial grasses with a basal area or base area more than 4 square centimetres, and decomposing litter. So that's how I think about it. How can I easily step from one mature perennial grass to another? And as people that know me, I'm not very tall. So, and then in between, we're looking at the degree of composting or decomposing of the litter. This is like sheet composting over the whole land surface of your grazing areas. So it can be used for forests and horticulture and viticulture, lots of areas. But if you want the land to be stable, it's got to be covered in a grazing situation. If you want the land to infiltrate water, it's got to have mature perennial grasses with litter cover and a bit of surface roughness, and to cycle nutrients so that we don't have to thanks Granville. You've got to have that basal cover of perennial grasses. So in a grazing situation, it's about the perennial grass. So talking to Gabe Brown, so I'm friends with Gabe and stuff, so we talk a bit, and he said that he goes to perennial grass unless he's also cash cropping. So he drops his covers and goes to perennial grass unless he's cash cropping, because he says that the risk and the profit from the covers is only supported if you're also cash cropping. And I just keep saying that, and I go, well, I don't know anyone that's better at cover cropping than Gabe, but he doesn't do it for just a grazing alone situation. So I'll keep coming back to that. So any of those questions on that? So this is pretty solid stuff. All David Tongway and Norm Hindley kept doing was going out and getting soil samples, measuring infiltration and nutrient cycling and erosion, and worked out what are the factors that you need to look at, and then what are their relationships. And you can actually put it into an Excel, little Excel tool, that if you measure soil cover and basal cover of perennial grass, you can predict accurately the stability, water infiltration and nutrient cycling. Just going on, decomposing litter is the common link between all of these. This one's here is from Southwest Victoria. This one's here is in the Otways. This one here is from Gabe's place and his soil. And it's got that common decomposing brown colour. It's always that sort of browny colour. So it'll go from a yellowy or a grey colour to a brown colour. This is what we do. We assume that the grazing's been severe and let the plants fully recover. So the cycle is to go from a mature plant ready to be grazed through severe graze, shifting root reserves, starting to put up solar panels, completely put up the solar panels and starting to replace the root reserves, and then solar panels plus litter, which is from leaf emergence rate, and the roots are all replaced. So this plant physiology is well known and well studied. The difference between what we're talking about here and say the dairy industry is they never go far enough to get new litter. And if you don't grow new litter, you don't increase landscape function. The most toxic part of a plant is about here, and this gives you metabolic diseases, foot problems, low fertility. It's got excess non-protein nitrogen, scours the animals, dirty bottoms. You guys all know this. You would have put them on young crops and scoured the guts out of them. So you know that that's the way it works. So the only thing that I'm saying differently is that I'm saying we need to know that that our animals are severe grazers, so it's best to take it down hard and then let it replenish its solar panels from root reserves. That's different from about 90% of all the advisors. But this was what I was taught. So this was in Alan's book originally, and I'll go on and explain what I'm talking about here, and just confirming that. So yeah, the animals, one plant will, well, sorry, the better grasses are always get a graze severely. The animals don't mow by height. They actually find a plant that they like and then eat it down. So if they eat the better grasses down hard, then you may as well eat most of them down hard, is my view. This has got very poor landscape function, this photo from Alan's book. You know, that's good perennial grass maturity, good basal area, but no decomposing litter in the intertussock space. And that means that all this area is not cycling nutrients, it's not infiltrating, and it's not stable. But when I say not, it's just much, much lower than it should be. Just a few quick definitions. So I sort of had a few questions from people about what are those different definitions. So I've tried to go and just sort of go through, and this really busted my brain trying to do this. So this is comparing all the different advisors sort of, and I tried to go for people that you'd know and things like that. So so there's two schools of thought. One is you go for leaf-driven recovery. You try not to graze more than 50% of the solar panels down, and then it'll recover quicker. That focus and that thing was based on research by a guy called Frank Kreider, which I've got in the notes as well. But so you'll have heard that, don't graze too much of it, move them on and it'll recover quicker. Yes, it does, but it fails in practice. I'm in this second school of thought. So graze it hard, graze it severely. And it was great to see that some of the surveys that Dan's got and what I've asked for people as well show that that's sort of being picked up, that I'm talking differently about these two. Because I think you need to know what are the differences, and both of them have different costs and benefits. So this is what I've found to work from numerous safe to fail trials around Australia and USA, Brazil, Mongolia, those sort of things. So this is just what I call myself. So I'm saying I'm mainly root-driven recovery. And I've tried to put this in priority. So it's not smooth and it's not accurate. And like people could argue that I've got it wrong. I have no problem with that. Happy to change it. But I've just sort of tried to do a first blush of what I see as the observed outcome and what I've measured. So when I'm talking, everything's about landscape function. Everything, high emphasis on the land, very low risk profit and low cost. So that's sort of my whole driver there, is low risk, no inputs. A lot of people go for low inputs, but they're sort of still risky. If you increase intensity of grazing or cropping or more dairy cows or whatever, you increase risk. So intensity increases your seasonal risk and your market price risk. So I'm trying to not increase intensity. So that's sort of my focus. So holistic management. So it's a bit of a broad church, so it's hard to talk about. But when I go and sit in on other people's training, we'll go and talk to people on their farms that have done holistic management training. So this is the Alan Savory and the Savory Institute and Holistic Management International. They're mainly talking about leaf-driven recovery. So sometimes they say graze it a little bit harder, all that sort of stuff. But you'll know that they're talking about leaf-driven recovery if they go faster in spring. The focus for this is stocking rate. So Alan's got a really big thing about increasing stocking rate. And a lot of the people that he's trained have also followed that. So that works incredibly well in your low rainfall, 300 mil rainfall, metre and a half evaporation, you must increase stocking rate in what they say out in Western Division, New South Wales, in the outside country. You must increase stocking rate to get the land to come good. So the reason and thinking why this flips, between outside country and the high rainfall zone is that in the outside country, there's usually a grass plant every couple of kilometres, and that's being generous for a lot of the outside country. And if you put one grass plant every kilometre, you double the stocking rate. And then you need to use the animals to germinate and establish. And I've got lots of photos of how we do this out there. So outside country, in the high rainfall zone, most properties are already overstocked. If you're already feeding for 3 to 4 months a year, then you're overstocked for this sort of grazing. So that's what we need to be thinking about. And it flips. So you can't just say with holistic management plan grazing, you can increase your stocking rate. It depends. Are you in the high rainfall zone already overstocked, or are you in the Western Division, say, of New South Wales, and you need more animals to get it to work to make that? So I've got stocking rate, profit, and then land health. I've never done an RCS course. I've only ever worked with people. I did do a week's co-training recently where we ran a week of workshops with one of the guys from RCS around Central West New South Wales. And that was interesting, sort of. So, but I felt that there was a stocking rate focus, then profit, then land health. So, I'm saying that this is my best guess from my exposure to what it has been. One of the places that we went to, they had thistles, and the owner asked, what would you do here, Graeme? And I said, well, the cause of the thistles being here, it was a good perennial grassland, native grass, sort of between Wellington and Dubbo in there. And I said, the thistles and the Bathurst burr and all the other things, they only grow if your recovery between each grazing is too short. That's how you grow them. So I would increase recovery, and I would promote germination. And I would promote germination of more perennial grass by increasing the stock density. So at the same stocking rate, he's got to increase stock density and utilisation to get longer recovery anyway. So that was my advice. And the RCS guy said, oh, well, Graeme, I think you're wrong. I think he needs to shorten recovery and increase stock density. So I'm saying increase recovery, he's saying shorten that. And then I just said to the farmers that were there, to the workshop participants, this is a classic example of the experts disagree. You're going to need to do your own safe to fail trials and work out which is right. So in the complex domain, there's competing hypotheses, and you can't work it out unless you do it on your land, the safe to fail trials. So I'll keep coming back to that. So Johann Zeetzman, he has an increasing stocking rate to increase profit and then worrying about land health. Not a big fan of landscape function. I really like Johann Zeetzman. I'll come back to that, Hannah, won't be a sec. I really like Johann Zeetzman. Someone wrote to me the other day, and they said they used my advice for the grazing and Johann for the selecting animals that perform on fully recovered grass. And I said, so do I. So Johann, sort of his ability to understand cattle and a bit of sheep is sort of probably the best in the world, and how to use breeding to increase hardiness and fertility and all those sort of things. Jim Elizondo, same sort of focus, stocking rates, their focus, not their first thought is, how do I increase the stocking rate to increase profit, and then I'll get some land health. Gabe sort of does a bit of, he switches a bit sort of thing. So if you read his book, you'd think he was leaf driven. If you speak to him, you think he's root driven. So, but he has a landscape function focus. Every time you see a photo, or every time you're with him, he goes into the paddock, he's smelling it, he's going for the fungal content, he's actually doing all that sort of analysis about the soil health. He's very focused on profit and low risk and low cost. And then Alan Williams, who works with Gabe in the Understanding Ag, I think he's back in this school. Joel Salatin, I think he's got more of a land health focus than a profit focus, but he's also talks a fair bit about stocking rate, and I'd say that he was leaf driven as well. So Christine Jones, I've got a question about, good question, Michael. The I don't, I'll come back, sorry, I'll finish, Joel. Christine sort of has a mainly leaf driven recovery. I'm really good friends with Christine. She came to see us down at Port Fairy, and I was expecting her to turn up on the Friday night, but nothing happened, and she didn't turn up. And I thought, oh, she must have got held up. Then I got a phone call from the Port Fairy Hospital, and she had got food poisoning from the Chinese restaurant and was on a drip in the Port Fairy Hospital because she was that sick. And the nurse said, "Can you go and get her sons from the motel?" And I was going, "Oh my God, these boys had never met me. They were young teenagers. Come with me. Your mum said you've got to come with me." So I took my eldest son, who was about 10, and all Jack said to them was, "We've got Xbox," and they were in the car. So so we're good friends. Like, you don't send someone to get your sons when you're not good mates. But yeah, so she has mainly a leaf-driven focus and an observed outcome. I had the question about the high landscape. Once you repair landscape function, high rainfall, will you then see your stocking rate increase? Not necessarily. It could always be a bit lowered. But really, it's not about stocking rate, it's about profit. So what I'm driven by is land health and profit. We know that most properties are over the top, the optimum for stocking rate. They're usually over there. And all I do to people is say, take out 5 or 10% of your stock and see what happens. If your profit goes up, it means you are over the optimum. And you keep taking out some until you find the optimum and you start to reduce your profit. So that's because it's it's far too complex for me to work out. It's rainfall dependent, it's market dependent, it's there's a lot of stuff going on. So the only way is to tinker, muddle through, Alan Savory would say. So I just take a few out. And you see it's in dairies, it's in the literature and things like that. They take animals out, the milk production goes up and the profit goes up. So we've got to know that we've been given advice that hasn't put us at the right stocking rate. And the only way to do it is to explore where you are on that curve. So, yes, may or may not, but the stocking rate is not the determinant. It's profit that you're chasing. So we've got a little bit too over-focused on stocking rate. And I'm saying that all this, so if you focus on production, you get that curve of increasing gross income and not shifting the net income. So declining terms of trade if you do that. So Michael, Dick Richardson's grazing naturally. So Dick was trained by Alan Savory as well, and he's developed his own version. I'm not sure which one you'd stick it into. I don't think it's leaf-driven and root-driven. So there's a really clear way of sort of explaining what Dick's focus is. So I'm focused on producing litter to get landscape function in the intertussock space. Dick's argument is that I'm looking at fungal decay and cycling the nutrients through that soil nutrient cycle. He's saying that he's using animal-focused cycling of the dry matter. I'm doing a lot of it through the soil, also through the animals with what they eat, but a lot of it through the soil. So he's saying, no, put most of it through the animals. So, and go shift, I've forgotten the words, that's why I'm stumbling. Shift from fungal decomposition to animal-driven recycling of the dry matter. So quite different from either of these ones. So it does have more of a stocking rate, I think, because he said to me on one of the group phone calls that I'd cost people a lot of money, because I didn't focus on increasing their stocking rate, and less of a focus on land health. So I'd say he fits into this observed area here, but you couldn't describe him as sort of doing leaf-driven or root-driven recovery, because at times his grazing will do that, and at other times his grazing will do that. But the key point, oh, sorry, Peter. Yeah, I'll make sure I do. So, so the question from Hannah was: once you repair the landscape function in the high rainfall zone, will you then see your stocking rate increase, or will it always be lowered? And the one from Michael Gooden was: where does the Dick Richardson grazing naturally fit in this chart? So I'm not sure. Sort of, I'll have to think about it more, Michael. It sort of swaps around a fair bit. Thanks for the question, Hannah and Michael. Just my definition of perennial grass recovery: when it looks like an ungrazed plant contains fresh yellow litter. The first half of that is Alan Savory's definition, and then this is my definition. What I was trying to say here is, you need to be aware that the experts disagree and that there's confusion and complexity, and you're going to have to work out which one works for yourself. I'm advocating this, but a lot of people aren't doing that. I don't mind that, but I go, show me where you've done the work yourself to show which works best on your land. And that's all I do. So it's a bit of a one-trick pony, I think. When it looks like an ungrazed plant contains fresh yellow litter, it depends on temperature and soil moisture. So temperature and soil moisture driving that leaf emergence, and a bit linked to the previous management. So aspect and all that sort of stuff. So you need to monitor. You actually need to check, have the plants replaced their litter, and quite a lot of litter I was trying to show in here. And then it's ready to be grazed. So when you come in and graze it, you graze the green and you push the litter onto the soil surface. You don't pick up the litter. Horses and sheep can pick up litter. So you've just got to take them off before they pick up the litter, but use it as well as you can. So just quickly, safe to fail trials we talked about. This is doing that sort of intense little areas at a different range of recoveries, at a different range of utilisation. You usually need a few. You want some to be failing. You really got to drive and make some that the recoveries are too long and the recoveries are too short. So just so that you start to find out, and it's that whole idea of it's steering your way. So you're looking for the markers. How does your land respond? So I always get people to do at least a couple that they've got long recoveries, so greater than 12 months, at a sheep per square metre or a cow per 3 square metres. So it's got to be that sort of density, because you want a quick answer. And I'm saying at least do one at that high utilisation. So that's why I used that safe to fail trial background on the survey. that I sent out, and I'll make sure that I keep talking about these things and put in the notes how to do these safe to fail trials. I think that's how you determine which grazing school works for you, all that sort of stuff, what utilisation. So there's a link between where your animals are and the utilisation. There's a whole suite of things. Once you do that, a couple of safe to fail trials, I'd set up at least one paddock with strips in it. A guy was saying to me the other day that that he keeps subdividing the paddocks, and he's going to do what I say once he's subdivided the paddocks. I said, you've got to stop thinking I'm going to make smaller paddocks. It'll drive you crazy. I said to him, you'll be 1,000 years old by the time the paddocks are right and small enough. Don't do that. Do this strip idea. Try it at least in one paddock. You'll be 1,000 years old and the gates will drive you crazy, I said. So pull back out of that. Don't do the cells. If you want to do what I'm talking about, don't do the cells. Don't do the subdividing the paddocks. Learn how to do some of that strip fencing. Even if you only do one strip and it's a disaster, at least do that, because it's the only way you see. So it's too slow to keep subdividing to get to the density that you need to make this work. Yeah, so I'd keep doing that and doing that trials, doing the safe to fail trials. Gabe does this, Colin Sykes does this, everyone that's sort of doing lots and lots of trials every year. Gabe's trying to fail 3 a year. Colin's similar. Do you know, you've got to be doing these sort of things just so that you can actually say, oh, I've tried that. So I did safe to fail trials on, biochar, compost teas, just about anything that you can think of. I've done trials on it, all the biological inputs, all the other things, so that at least I know how they react and what was the lowest cost, lowest risk thing to do. And then once you've got some of this in place, it'll start selecting for animals that have that phenotype that thrive under this management. But you've actually got to do the fencing in front of selecting the animals. I work with a lot of people that are trying to get animals that are already adapted to this before they start. And I think it's the wrong way around. What we found in Southwest Victoria and up at near Braidwood and things like that was once we started putting the animals under pressure, they started to improve, and the next generation was better. So you've got to select animals that have got the right phenotype, the right maturity, the right fat, the right muscle and testosterone in the males, in the sires, and then the females are inherently fat and always have high fertility. So this is really the basis of getting this right. So my thing is that, if you're not wanting to do the trials, if you're not wanting to put in the convenient infrastructure, if you're not wanting to change your animals, I usually say I wouldn't start. So that's sort of where I've got to, because I find that people just get frustrated that they haven't got enough animals to get animal performance and do that. When you start and the animals mightn't be right, all I do is I put them under stock density, but I decrease the utilisation. And as they adapt, I increase the utilisation, because as you increase that utilisation, everything starts to flow. But you're starting to get litter cycling at that higher stock density. You're starting to do a lot of that germinating the perennial grasses that are already in the soil, all that sort of stuff. So that's the sort of order and the roadmap that I'd be talking about. And just that safe to fail trials is navigation aids. So some you want to steer towards, you've got to have a range. So some you want to steer towards, some you want to steer well away from. So you want to be able to find the channel that gets you back into the deep water. Oh, this is in a different order. So that's for the questions from yesterday. So I have a problem between people talking about cover cropping and perennial grass, and that was why I talked about Gabe saying that if he's not cash cropping, then he puts it back to prairie, he says, so back to perennial grass. So Christine's doing a lot of cover cropping and the 4 plant families and not grasses. So I'm saying that there's 2 schools of thought running here as well, that you can cover crop your way into grazing profitability, and I don't think you can. But then if you want land health with cover crops, Christine is the best. She's just all over this research. She knows how to do it. So if you're not going to go for perenniality, which is the lowest cost, lowest risk, then I'd be following Christine. If you are wanting to do the lowest cost, lowest risk, I'd be making it a perennial grassland. So, you know, it depends what you're doing. If it's a cash cropping situation that you're then putting some covers in, which Gabe would say is the only time to do it, then definitely go with the 4 plant families and do that. I'll talk about the 50% before being shifted on, but it's pretty clear it doesn't work in practice. It's all based on the Frank Kreider research. Yeah, so it's complex. So you're going to have to study it and look at what's happening and who's getting good results, doing road trips, trying to find people that are doing the root reserve recovery and read stuff. So I'll include some materials, but it's of the people that I'm working with that are doing a good job, and I'm just about to release. They're all high rainfall, so we've got video diaries and things like that coming out of Kiowa. So yeah, so I'll come back, Stephen, sorry, to your question. I'm just sort of on a bit of a roll on this one, so I've got my brain stuck. How do you balance stock performance and pasture performance in a more intensive grazing system, e.g. ewes and lambs can't be moved as well as cows and calves? No, they are harder to use, and a lot of people have developed two-wire electric fencing strips, and then 2-wire across the front. Others are using 3 wires for ewes and lambs and training them. You know, some of the people I work with are making sure that they always, the maiden ewes run with the more mature ewes to be trained to electric fence and stuff like that, and how to behave. So yeah, so it is a bit of a balance. It's one of the few times that I actually like the word balance. Most people use balance as a proxy for I'm doing the right thing and I'm not going to change. But so the land needs high utilization, high stock density, and long recoveries, which ends up with lower protein and energy and more fiber and stuff, which is tough on animal performance. So I'm saying we need the land to be getting better. I'm saying I don't think there's anyone that doesn't think that we need the land to be getting better. So we've got to stop saying that you're going to get preference and start putting the pressure back on the animals. And next week I'll put in some how the cattle have changed, and I've got a lot of that. But basically, there's been a decline in robustness of animals over time, and selecting using a lot of the data that we've been collecting and stuff has reduced their robustness. So yeah, so I'd start where you are, like I said, and that. So, but it can be done, and I use gut fills, dung scores, contentment scores, drinking scores, so that people can do that. And the key early warning is when people go out to their animals, I get them to answer the questions. Do they Do they look different? Are they behaving different? Do they smell different? So that sort of, for some reason, lifts people up so that they really switch on to that observing. Otherwise, we miss things. So we're trying to catch the early warning. Look different, behave different, smell different. I usually start people with some safe to fail trials at least 12 months, because I think that most areas enjoy that. There's a few dairies that I work with that are less than 12 months in those real high rainfall, or irrigated situations. But generally what the research shows about risk is that if you have a rainfall risk, you usually have to de-intensify most areas. Where you have irrigation, or sort of live at Coffs Harbour or something, then you can actually intensify. But generally most farms are over intensified, is what the research is showing. I'll come back more on that as we go. I wasn't sure about this one, but obviously I wrote the question wrong, so it was just clumsy English. I wanted questions, them to be at the bottom line there. This is a pre-workshop survey, so I get questions and answers for the next one, not just incorrect, not just a post-webinar. So it wasn't deliberate or trying to trick people or anything. It was just maybe clumsy English. And then I'll just read out Stephen's question here. So Graeme, my question, the safe to fail trial area gives you an idea of stocking rate and recovery period that then helps you with your grazing plan and then monitoring animal performance in the feed ahead of you. Wouldn't that indicate if you're overstocked or not? E.g., you're running out of grass or have heaps of grass in front of you. Yeah, not from the safe to fail trial area, Stephen. That gives you an idea. It's a bit of it's a trial, so it's not sort of telling you how much grass you've actually got in front. What I do for that, and it doesn't give you an idea of stocking rate, it gives you an idea of the stocking density that rapidly regenerates your land, and the recovery period. And what it does is it allows you to look at that recovery period and think about it in terms of what you're doing in the other areas and the stock density and the utilization. So it provides really high quality feedback to design what you do need. When you do a grazing plan and realize how many days you need to be in each paddock, or what area of the total grazing area you're grazing on a daily basis, that tells you whether you're overstocked or not. So if you can't, the way we do it is that we say, well, we want to graze about 1/420th of the farm per day. That'll give us 14 months recovery. If it increases a little bit, then we'll sell to get back to that 14 months recovery. But that includes in that 14 months, not only the land regeneration and the fibrous roots of the perennial grasses refluffing the soil after the grazing, and high stock density, and making sure that you're drought proof because you're linking up moisture and temperatures. It includes all that in that 14 months. It includes that, like at where my cows are in southern New South Wales, where they got 200 mils sort of over the weekend, that you needed to skip them on. It includes that some weekends that you'd plan to put them somewhere and they break out, or you find out that you're not going to be home for the week, so you've got to actually give them a big area. That long recovery includes all that to make sure that the grazing never fails. So that's my focus. So so the planning and running out of grass, I find that if you can't get the number of days that you're supposed to be in a paddock, then you actually are overstocked and you need to sell. So the variable is not the recovery of the land. The variable is your stocking rate. The brake and accelerator is your stocking rate. There's a lot of, I think that there's sort of things going on, like people are thinking that, I want to achieve this, a lot of this argument about, oh, well, that's not in context for me, which I've taught sort of since mid-90s. So, but it's confusing me at the moment, because what's sort of showing up is that people want things to happen. And as far as I can tell, the grasses just aren't interested in what we're trying to achieve. They just are, and they need to recover, and the land needs to recover. So what we have to do is work out what that is, and then work out how to make low risk, low cost profit in that. So, I feel like the grasses are completely disinterested in what we're trying to achieve. And some of the other questions: what rest period is required in a winter multi-species mix? The big issue that I see is not having permanent ground cover in cropping. So gave plants all these things into permanent ground cover. So we need these winter multi-species to be higher in carbon, lower in nitrogen. So I'd be pushing them out so that they're actually getting quite fibrous, so that you get that long-lived litter on the soil surface. But that requires quite a few changes and stuff, but that would be my advice. I've got some of the soil carbon benefits from grazing as compared to cropping. The quick and easy one is to say that a lot of the work that CSIRO, Jeff Baldock and all those others have done, they always give a double tick or three crosses, showing that if you shift from cropping to grazing, you will increase soil carbon. It's got moderate to high repeatability, and it generally is one of the biggest steps. If you wanted to increase soil carbon, shifting from cropping to perennial grazing would be the sort of the obvious one to do, but a lot of the time we don't want to do that, so we have to do other things like cover crops and soil cover and decomposing litter and stuff. I hope I've covered off on this. I don't call what I do cell grazing anymore, because I don't use cells, so I'm just calling it landscape function grazing. I don't think we need to focus on productivity. I think productivity is the wrong thing to look at. I think we need to look at profitability. So when I'm doing gross margins with people, we take into account how often they are successful and how often they actually achieve that result, and how do they get as much of the costs out of it. So, which is a different focus. I think that productivity is a driver that actually misleads us, and we need to focus on your profit with your land, with your grazing, your cropping, that sort of thing. So don't focus on higher productivity. I think it just leads us into tears, and it creates that graph of declining terms of trade. Fencing and water options, I'll come back to. Rotational grazing into 100% cropping business. There is, and I'll put a link here, this guy here on this link on the video, he uses dual purpose grazing crops and cover crops to run a dairy. I'm not sure it's the lowest cost, lowest risk thing to do. But he seems to be able to make it work, that he's always got crops coming through and stuff. If you're just using dual purpose grazing crops, I don't think you can do it. But I could be wrong. I'm always saying that, I've said a lot of times I don't think you can do something, and then someone goes, I can. But I think that you need at different times to be able to put them out onto a grazed pastured area. I would say a perennial grass area, that you've got to shift and work out what are the ratios of grazing to cropping that provides the most profit, lowest cost, lowest risk. And I typically see that people have actually got too much cropping going and not enough grazing going, and often see people shifting back the other way and finding that they're actually keeping money in the business. So this isn't using agribusiness or Birchip Cropping Group or DPI safe to fail trials. It's doing the work on your own property and working out, well, what does create a gross margin here? How often does this fail? Like I've been working with people that sort of, and they designated certain areas as their cropping ground and certain areas as their grazing. But then they find that the areas they've designated from cropping are suffering from frost because they're the lower areas. There's all that. You've got to be running the whole thing, and you've got to be very careful of advice. Do safe to fail trials. So what I'm saying is and I try and explain to people, I wouldn't take advice from a little fella sitting from Branksome. I would go out and do the trials. So so we need to be doing that. So this is this change from cropping to pasture. Usually has a good soil carbon benefit and moderate confidence in that it usually works. This is out of the Dairy Australia 2018 report, but others will have that this is higher in this and maybe a high confidence. So, but it tends to be one of the strongest, that cropping to pasture systems. This is sort of just a photo of when we were working around Shepparton, so with Gabe and Cole. And just I wrote to him sort of in 2021 because people were saying, no, Gabe doesn't graze like that. But the key point being on my ranch, it is 12 to 15 months. And that's in North Dakota. That works well in sort of our areas as well. But do the trials. So he was talking about like down southern USA. He thinks it takes a minimum of 120 days. But he's looking at the landscape function and the fungal content and doing all that. So I've got a question here, another one from Stephen Hobbs. So while a person is in the process of letting the ground rebalance and go back to grasses, wouldn't cover crops multi-species provide a good feed alternative to fill the gap? It could do, yeah. And I'll just sort of tell another Gabe story. So Stephen, that what Gabe does is if he's taking a bit of cropping ground and putting it back to perennial grass, he'll do 2 years of back-to-back cover crops at really high carbon nitrogen ratio to make the soil fungal so that it's really easy when he resows his perennial grasses, that they'll take and go well. I say that's probably a good idea. If you wanted to put an area back to trees, I say go through a high perennial grass landscape function, and then the trees will be more likely to have the conditions they need. So yes, they are, as long as you're focusing in. So cover crops are inherently higher risk than doing safe to fail trials and regenerating just using grazing. So you've got to work out, does it work for you? And I'd be doing safe to fail trials on that cover crops, and then doing all those techniques of making sure that you're going for that. I might run out of time, but this is what the soil surface looks at Gabe's in all these areas. It's always covered. And just the soil carbon data, I think I put this in last time, that this was his trajectory. So he went to no-till because of the hailstones, then increased the cash crop diversity, then increased the covers, then increased the diversity of the covers, and then integrated livestock. And that trajectory on that carbon and stuff, but we'll come back to that. I won't spend too much time on it. This is the Frank Kreider research that if people want that USDA bulletin I've got. So it's just, it was done in glass-sided cases and staining roots and things like that. So this is what people are all talking about, the 50%. So it goes from none, control, 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, 50% defoliation. And then they said, oh, well, you only want to graze half of it. I'm not into it at all, but that doesn't matter. It's the person that usually gets blamed for introducing this idea of the sigmoid curve and only grazing the top half. is Andre Voisin, and this is out of his book, Grass Productivity. Sorry, I'm rushing. But yeah, so he's saying, yeah, just graze the top. That seems the logical idea, he says, but this is the kicker. At the bottom of that page, he says, we see here again, sound, theoretical and scientific running foul of practical obstacles. I see this a lot. So, you know, until you do the safe to fail trial, you can't foresee this. And I liked it because it had, which could not be foreseen a priori. So prior to actually going out and doing the grazing, it sounded like a bloody good idea, only graze the top. So I'm saying don't use this idea. It doesn't work because the animals graze the parts they prefer before going on to the parts they like less. So I think that, yeah, the person that gets sort of the credit for suggesting that we graze on the sigmoid curve is also the person that says that it doesn't work. I think you need to do a trial. I don't think it can be a grazing principle. I don't think you can use the sigmoid curve as a grazing principle because of that. And then Johan says as well in his book that the recommendation should not be that grass should not be defoliated close to the ground. It just takes longer to recover, will be of value one day when cattle have been taught to graze at an even height. So what happens is, though, that if you try and do this grazing over time, and this depends on brittleness and soil types and a whole, you'll lose the better grasses and you'll tend to get a monoculture. So in the high rainfall zones that I work in, you get a monoculture of a grass that's not as good. Typically in Tasmania, it'd be Cotsfoot, in southwest Victoria to be Phalaris. Do you know, it's that sort of stuff that you lose the perennial ryegrass and the weeping grass and a lot of that diversity. You end up with a monoculture of a lower, poorer grass than that. So I know in a lot of areas to be able to have Cotsfoot and Phalaris would be considered fantastic, but yeah, I'm sure you get the idea. Because if you're one of those better grasses in that pasture, you don't get a light graze, you get severely grazed, and the other less palatable grasses get less graze, so they recover and everything looks good. But you, as the better grass, have been nailed. You've had a severe graze, so you're still lagging behind. The animals come back in, you get regrazed again, and eventually you get your root reserves depleted, and then you die. So that's what happens to those better grasses in that. I've got a bit sort of anthropocentric or something there. I've done lots of this. This is from Sydney University data. So this is the difference from a project that we did, communities in landscapes. And when, so we did an action on the ground one, which is the root reserve driven one in red. And we did a communities in landscape project. That was, the blue was mainly in New South Wales. The red was in Victoria and New South Wales. And it's sort of the summary and of what happened. So we get higher landscape function scores, more stability, more water infiltration and more nutrient cycling. So, so any more questions? I've sort of been prattling on and I'll do this next week, just about how to do some of this quick planning and the way I do it. But that was basically a good place to stop for me, Dan. Does that work for you?
Yeah, that's really good. We're at the top of the hour, Graeme. So if you want to finish up there and we'll pick it up next week. Is that suit you?
Yeah, it does. I felt like I might have overdone the sort of the difference between what people are saying, but I couldn't think of any other way of doing it. I like all those people and I'm friends with most of them and stuff. But I'm trying to say they have a different emphasis, and that's completely understandable because this is incredibly complex. So, and the only way to understand it is to do it. So one of the things I check for is that the definition of insanity does not apply in the complex areas of our life. And if it's got people, money, and environment in it, it's usually complex. It's impossible to do the same things twice. So you're looking for patterns and trends rather than absolute answers. And that was really the point I was trying to make.
Yep. No, very good. If there's no more questions today, I'll just see there's one in the chat from Peter. Great session, Graeme. Which I think it was another fantastic session. A lot of really good information in there. So thanks again for your time today. You know, it's 2 out of 6 that the next 4 are going to be really, really good. I'm looking forward to them. So
Fantastic.
really good. You know, from my perspective, haven't got a lot of grazing experience, but it's really good to hear about that landscape function and that sort of thing. So really love your idea of fail-safe trials, and I think it's something that we could do in any business. I think we really need to be trialing things that work and trialing things that don't work, particularly when the experts don't agree. And yeah, I think as managers, we need to find what works best in our context, no matter what enterprise that we've got. So, there are no failed trials. If you learn something from a trial, it hasn't failed. It's a learning tool, in my opinion. So, so thanks very much, Graeme, again for your time today. Big thank you again to the Wimmera CMA through the funding from Australian Government's National Landcare program. Big thank you again for your support. This will be recorded again today and will be available on our YouTube channel. And you will be able to see or find the link for next week's webinar again with Graeme. Same time, same place. So 7 AM Thursday morning. You will find a survey at the end in your window, again, like what we had last week. So if you could fill that out, that would be fantastic. Thank you. What else have we got? Yeah, the recording will be available. So yeah, if you missed anything or a lot of those great information, great slides that Graeme had, yeah, you'll be able to find them. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Graeme. Thanks to the CMA Landcare, and we'll see you all next week.
Thanks for your time.